Hello, welcome to today's video. If you're new here, I'm Lois and I like to talk about books. Today's book we're going to be talking about is The Language of Creation, Cosmic Symbolism in Genesis by Matthieu Pageau. So in today's video I'm going to talk about how I came to find the book as well as the Symbolic World podcast, which it's kind of linked to. I'm going to give a little summary as best as I can and any comments I have on it, and I might tell you a little story at the end as well. So, how did I come to find the book? That's quite a big question. Okay, let's take it back. I became a Christian about 6 years ago, probably classing myself as evangelical, non-denominational. But then 2, maybe 3 years ago, I had quite a bit of a faith crisis. I recently read A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, and he describes his faith kind of like a house of cards, and it felt like that for me at the time with my faith crisis. It felt like a house of cards that was knocked down, and it took me a few months to rebuild it. For other people it might take longer, shorter, or maybe they don't rebuild it at all. So there were quite a few things that I realised other people around me believed, but I was trying to force myself to believe, and it didn't actually make sense to me. Like, I needed time to work out if I even still believed in God, who I thought Jesus was. And there were a few influences who really helped me work out these things slowly again. So I'd been watching the psychologist Jordan Peterson for a number of years, and in the midst of my faith crisis, he released a few videos with a man called Jonathan Pageau, who is an Orthodox Christian. And Jordan Peterson was really just wrestling, asking very honest questions. He was crying. He could tell that there was some significance about Christ, there was something different about him, but he couldn't quite work out what was going on. And I think Pageau's just empathy, giving great answers, all these things just really moved me. The topics he was covering a lot I found really interesting, including like the role of narrative, the importance of attention. Yeah, I think those were the main things really. So I'd been watching Jonathan Pageau's YouTube/podcast, The Symbolic World, for a year, 2 years maybe, and there were bits I really loved about it, but I just felt like I wanted a little bit more depth, and I knew that his brother Matthieu Pageau had written this book, so I asked for it for my birthday. I went through it quite slowly over about 6 months, writing lots of notes, and yeah, I just thought it was a great book. So let's go on to my summary of the book. I'm going to show you some notes I made on a whiteboard. I apologise if it's a bit messy. I blame it on being left-handed, that's my excuse. But to begin with, he differentiates between a spiritual worldview and a materialist worldview. So when exploring a phenomenon from a spiritual worldview, you might ask questions like, what does it mean? What higher truth does it embody? And in a materialist worldview, you might ask, what is something made of? How does it work? I thought it was a really great point and premise to start off with, because science and religion, there's a lot of debate, conversation, confusion around it, and I thought it was just helpful to clarify that in the beginning. And then in chapter 4, called Reconstructing the Language of Creation, Pageau differentiates between modern and archaic concepts. So an example that I really like that he gives is of a fish. So obviously you have Jonah and the great fish. In our materialist modern sense, fish has a very specific definition. It doesn't just mean any creature in the sea. Pageau gives the taxonomical definition of a gill-bearing aquatic craniate animal that lacks limbs with digits. He goes on to say instead a more ancient concept should be assumed, one that certainly included such animals as dolphins, whales, and other aquatic creatures. So a fish in the archaic sense just meaning a creature of the sea. He says that neither one is right or wrong, however, when reading the Bible or other archaic ancient texts, you should see it in the archaic sense. He also gives the example of water. Obviously in a materialist sense, water is H2O, but he says that this only answers the materialist questions of what is it made of and how does it work. But using the archaic concepts and notions, water is more synonymous with liquid or fluidity. He then goes on to describe some bigger cosmic principles using this idea. So he talks about heaven and earth, and then later on in the book, time and space. So he describes how heaven and earth, time and space, don't have the same meanings in a materialist modern sense as they would in the archaic sense. He describes heaven as the more higher spiritual things and earth as the more lower material things. Time he describes, I believe, as a force of cyclical change. So instead of it being like minutes, hours, etc., it's more about what is causing things to change. And space is more about the idea of stability. And then throughout the book he gives many examples of how heaven and earth interact, how the heavenly and the earthly things interact with each other, and how time and space interact with each other. And that's basically what he's going through throughout the book, showing these patterns. There was a really great line in the book that I think summed up what it was all about, and that is that he describes the universe as a series of embedded microcosms where the same cosmic principles are expressed on different levels of reality. So that sentence is quite a mouthful. Let's try and break it down a little bit. First of all, a microcosm, it's kind of like a small representation of something. So the Cambridge University Press website describes it as a small place, society or situation that has the same characteristics of something much larger. So there are many examples of this, but one of them I've just picked in chapter 15 is Adam, or man, as microcosm, the breath and the body. So he's describing a man as being a miniature representation of how the universe works. So you have the breath and you have the body. The breath is the heavenly aspect and the body is the earthly, more material aspect. And they interplay together and you have man. So the cosmic principles are these things that I've just described: heaven, earth, space and time. And the different levels of reality, if I've understood them correctly, are individual, communal and cosmic. So you might see these things playing out in just one person. You might see this playing out on a communal scale in a group of people, or you might see this in a more metaphysical way on a cosmic scale. Unfortunately my camera nearly died, so I've had to take a break to charge it. Hopefully I can still get back in the flow a bit. But an example I really liked of these different levels of reality was on the symbolism of wine and fermentation. So he begins by describing the effects of intoxication, or the symptoms of intoxication, on the individual scale. So he lists blurred vision, slurred speech, memory loss, dizziness, loss of inhibitions, and then goes on to the more extreme ones of vomiting, loss of consciousness, even death. Then he goes on to the communal level. So he says severe drunkenness results in losing familiar space, which includes committing regretful acts, losing the support of family and friends, losing sources of work, losing work and sources of income, and becoming a homeless wanderer. And then on the cosmic scale, he says that wine represents time. So in one sense, because whilst it is a poison, it also has the elements of renewal, rest, recreation, and it also represents time because of the process of fermentation. He says this process is an important symbol of the transformative influences of death and decomposition. As he describes, fermentation can be interpreted as an influence that overturns and disintegrates everything. So he talks about wine being a microcosm of time and bread being a microcosm of space. So linking this back to that sentence that we went through, the microcosm itself is wine and bread. The cosmic principles are space and time, and you see those on the different levels of reality as described. So in the book he describes the concepts, he describes how the cosmic principles relate to each other through different microcosms in different examples. He goes through ones that you can just generally see in the world. He goes through some really interesting Bible stories, talks about the cherubim of Ezekiel, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the Garden of Eden, the walls of Jericho. He talks a lot about Adam, trees and snakes, the miracles of Moses. It's really, really interesting. I just love how he brings light to stories in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but when he describes them, it makes sense so quickly. So that is the end of my summary. I really encourage you to read the book itself because there's only so much depth I can go into in this short video. So as for my own comments on the book, I really enjoy the style, I enjoy how simplistic it is. It's not very academic, it doesn't have references, which might be off-putting for some, but Jonathan Pageau does have a video responding to that, so perhaps I will link that below. I also really love the diagrams in it. I believe that Matthieu Pageau has a background in computer science, so yeah, he has lots of little diagrams like this that are reinforced throughout the book, so then you pick up on the patterns with the different examples, and it just really helps you to absorb it and make sense of what he's saying, because a lot of the time things are very simple, but when you put them into words sometimes it complicates them more than needs be done. And I really like this line on the last page as well, didn't want to forget about it. Given a proper understanding of ancient cosmological concepts, the duality of a figurative versus literal interpretation usually resolves itself. So you might ask, as a Christian, what effect has this had on me? Has it had on my faith? And I made a few notes to help me express my thoughts. I felt that it gave me some freedom and peace in reading the Bible, because just from my experience of some Protestant teaching and exegesis, it's been very intense and moralistic. And I think because this was quite descriptive about what things mean, how they interact with each other, it enabled me to take a step back a little bit. And for me, I found that really helpful. It also helped me to consider the strange and weird things in the Bible. You know, you have the cherubim, you have Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, you have Ezekiel doing some crazy stuff in there, and that can be quite off-putting for people. But what I found in this book, and also in the Symbolic World podcast, is that both Matthieu and Jonathan Pageau, they don't shy away from these things, they go straight into it. I don't know if this is to do with the different worldviews that we're encountering it through, because in the spiritual worldview, if you're looking at a cherubim or the sons of gods in Genesis, looking at it in terms of meaning and what truth it embodies, in terms of what is it made of and how does it work, really has a big difference. Maybe this has some links as well to conspiracy theories. I think Jonathan Pageau recently did a really interesting video on that with a lady whose name I've forgotten, but perhaps I'll link that one below as well. My battery is on 3%, so I'm going to try and wrap this up quickly, but I wanted to end with a quick story time. So a couple of months ago, I believe it was the end of May, I was on the last chapter of this book, and the chapters are very short, so I was really nearly finished, and I was just going on YouTube and I saw that Jonathan Pageau posted that to any UK fans he would be doing a talk, and it was on that very day. And I looked, and it happened to be in my very city. So I looked on it, there were still tickets available, they were free, I booked a ticket, and I cannot explain how excited I was, because often if you book things far in advance, it's exciting, but when you find out that something's happening on that very day, I was ecstatic. I was running around like a crazy person. So I went to the talk, I really enjoyed it. Jonathan was doing a conversation with a guy called Matthieu, who I hadn't heard of before, but I've now listened to some of his talks, and he's a really interesting person as well. After the talk, we could all hang around for a bit, have drinks, food. It was a little bit fancy for me, but yeah, I just got to speak to some interesting people, and yeah, Jonathan Pageau was just there walking around, and I was like, wow, this person I've been listening to online for months is like 2 meters away from me. It was so exciting. And he seemed like a really lovely person as well. I didn't get to speak to him, but he seemed very happy just to go and talk to all these people who'd come to see him. And I managed to get a photo with him at the end as well. He was trying to leave, but I think that he probably saw I'd been waiting for a while, and I was just too shy to elbow my way in for a photo. So he took one with me, and then he left, and yeah, it was just a super exciting evening. I remember going into the work the next day and speaking to some of my colleagues saying, oh, I got a picture with one of my favourite YouTubers last night, and they're like, oh, who is it? Well, I've heard of them. And I was like, probably not. It was a talk on Christian symbolism, and yeah, they're like, no, whatever floats your boat. So I was very excited, and yeah, so that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the book, hearing about my story time at the end. And yeah, I'd really encourage you to read it. I'd really encourage you to check out the Symbolic World podcast. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.